The blizzard howled through Cedar Ridge like a wounded beast, driving ice crystals against the warped wooden buildings that lined the main street. Snow piled high against doorways, and the few souls brave enough to venture outside moved like ghosts through the white curtain of the storm. It was the kind of night when decent folk huddled close to their fires, but Thomas Hartley had long since ceased being decent folk. "She's blind. Take her." The words tore through the storm, raw and slurred with whiskey. Thomas stood in the doorway of his ramshackle cabin, one hand gripping the frame for support, the other gesturing wildly at the small figure behind him. Useless mouth to feed, can't see nothing, can't do nothing. Hazel May Hartley pressed herself against the rough wall inside, her fingers finding the familiar grooves in the wood. She'd traced them so many times they'd become a map of her imprisonment. Her father's voice carried on the wind, advertising her like livestock at market. Through the gaps in the walls, she could see shapes moving in the storm, neighbors peering through frost-covered windows, drawn by the commotion despite themselves. $20, Thomas bellowed. "Hell, I'll take 10.5, just take the burden off my hands." Mrs. Weatherby's curtains twitched across the way. Hazel knew that by morning. Every soul in Cedar Ridge would know how Thomas Hartley had tried to sell his blind daughter in a blizzard. The shame burned hotter than any fire. The wind shifted, carrying with it the crunch of heavy boots on snow. Through the swirling white emerged a figure that made even Thomas step back. The man stood well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat that made him appear even larger. Long black hair whipped around a face carved by wind and sun. And when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the land rather than merely existing upon it. Elias Redstone had been in Cedar Ridge less than a month, taking odd jobs at the livery and keeping to himself. The Apache blood that ran through his veins was enough to keep most townfolk at arm's length, which seemed to suit him fine. Now he stood before Thomas Hartley's door, snow gathering on his shoulders like a mantle. "You selling your daughter?" His voice was deep, quiet enough that Thomas had to lean forward to hear over the wind. "She's blind," Thomas repeated, as if that explained everything. "Been nothing but dead weight since her ma died. Can't cook proper, can't sew straight. What use is a woman who can't see?" Elias's dark eyes moved past Thomas to where Hazel stood frozen in the shadows. She kept her gaze down, had learned long ago that the unfocused look helped sell her father's lie. But something made her glance up, just for a moment, and their eyes met across the space. "I know you can see," he said, so soft that only she could hear. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she quickly dropped her gaze again, heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas hadn't heard. He swayed on his feet, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Well, you want her or not, I got drinking to do and no coin to do it with." Elias reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. The clink of coins made Thomas's eyes brighten with greedy hope. But instead of handing it over, Elias tossed it past him, where it landed with a soft thud on the cabin floor. "For supplies," Elias said. "The girl stays." "Now wait, The girl stays." There was iron in those 3 words. A finality that cut through Thomas's whiskey courage like a blade through butter. The bigger man didn't move, didn't threaten, but something in his stillness spoke of violence held in check by will alone. Thomas's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he stumbled back inside, snatching up the pouch with shaking hands. "Fine," he spat. "But she's still blind, still useless. You'll see." Elias said nothing, just stood there as the snow built tiny drifts in the folds of his coat. His eyes found Hazel's again, and this time she didn't look away. In that gaze, she saw something she'd never seen before. Not pity, not disgust, not the calculating look of someone figuring what use they could get from her. Just acknowledgement, recognition. "I'll bring wood tomorrow," he said, and then he was gone, swallowed by the storm as quickly as he'd appeared. Hazel remained frozen in place long after her father had stumbled to his cot. the leather pouch clutched to his chest. Through the thin walls, she could hear the whispers starting already. The Hartley girl. Sold like a horse, but somehow not sold. The Apache who'd paid but taken nothing. By morning, the story would have grown and twisted into something unrecognizable. She moved to the small window and scraped away the frost with her fingernail. The world outside was white and wild, the storm showing no signs of abating. Somewhere out there, Elias Redstone moved through the blizzard, and with him went the first person in 7 years to see through her father's lie. Hazel pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She'd been playing blind so long she sometimes forgot what it was like to truly see. Her father had started the charade after her mother's death, when the offers for her hand had begun coming. "A blind girl's no use to any man," he'd said, teaching her to let her eyes go vacant, to stumble over things left in her path. It kept the suitors away, kept her here to cook and clean and bear the brunt of his rages. Now someone knew. The thought terrified her more than any storm. The wind rattled the windows in their frames, and snow found its way through every crack and gap. Hazel pulled her thin shawl tighter and set about banking the fire for the night. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. It always did. But tonight, something had shifted in the world, subtle as a change in wind direction, but just as significant. In the morning, she would wake to find a neat stack of split wood by the door, covered with a piece of oilcloth to keep it dry. No footprints would mark the snow. The storm would have seen to that, but Hazel would know who had left it, just as she would know that her life in Cedar Ridge would never be quite the same. The blizzard raged on through the night, burying the small town deeper in white. But for the first time in 7 years, Hazel May Hartley didn't feel quite so cold. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bitter cold, the sun reflecting off fresh snow with a brightness that made eyes water. Hazel woke to find her father already gone, likely to the saloon to spend whatever remained of Elias's money. The cabin felt different somehow, as if the events of the previous night had left invisible marks on the walls. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, her movements automatic from years of practice. The pretense of blindness had become second nature, the careful way she felt along surfaces, the slight hesitation before each step, the unfocused gaze that never quite met anyone's eyes. Even alone, she maintained the charade. Old habits died hard, and in a town like Cedar Ridge, you never knew who might be watching. The wood by the door was exactly as she'd expected, split neat and clean, stacked with a precision that spoke of pride in simple work. She ran her fingers over the grain, wondering at hands that could be gentle enough for such care, yet strong enough to make her father back down. No one made Thomas Hartley back down, not when he had whiskey courage in him. By the time she ventured out for water, the town was stirring. She heard them before she saw them, the whispers that followed in her wake like shadows. "There's the Hartley girl." Heard her PA tried to sell her last night. "That Apache paid good money but didn't take her. What kind of game is that? Maybe he knows something we don't." "Mrs. Weatherby stood outside the general store, her sharp voice cutting through the morning air. "Hazel Hartley, you poor thing. How you managing with that father of yours?" Hazel kept her eyes down, one hand trailing along the hitching post as she'd learned to do. "We manage, Mrs. Weatherby." "Manage," the older woman snorted. "That's what you call it when a father tries to sell his own flesh and blood, and to an Apache no less. Though I suppose even they didn't want damaged goods." The word stung, but Hazel had heard worse. She mumbled something about needing to fetch water and continued on, feeling the eyes that followed her progress, in doorways and windows, behind curtains and shutters. Cedar Ridge watched and judged. At the well, she found Samuel Morrison and his son James hauling up the bucket. They stepped aside as she approached, but not far enough to be polite. She could smell last night's whiskey on Samuel's breath. "Morning, Miss Hartley," James said, and she heard the smirk in his voice. "Heard you had quite the evening. That Apache fella must have keen eyes to see through." "Well," he didn't finish. But his meaning was clear. "The well's all yours," Samuel added, "though I wonder how a blind girl manages to haul water without spilling a drop. Maybe you got yourself a guardian angel, a tall, dark one with Apache blood." Hazel's hands shook as she worked the well handle, but she kept her movements deliberately clumsy, letting water slosh over the bucket's rim. It was harder than being truly careful would have been, this calculated incompetence. The walk back to the cabin felt endless. Behind her, she heard James Morrison laugh, the sound following her like a mockery. Her father's shame had become hers, as it always did. But now there was something else mixed in with the familiar humiliation, the knowledge that someone knew her secret. The cabin was still empty when she returned. She set about her chores with mechanical precision, sweeping floors that didn't need sweeping, scrubbing surfaces already clean, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering to dark eyes that saw too much. It was near noon when she found it, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tucked just inside the woodshed where her father wouldn't think to look. Inside was dried meat, enough for several meals, and something else that made her breath catch. A small wooden carving, no bigger than her palm, a bird in flight, wings spread wide, every feather detailed with careful knife strokes. She turned it over in her hands, marveling at the skill. On the bottom, carved in tiny letters, were two words, "Eyes open." The front door slammed, making her jump. She quickly tucked the carving into her pocket as her father's heavy tread filled the cabin. "Girl, where's my dinner?" Thomas looked worse than usual, eyes bloodshot and clothes bearing the stains of a night spent in his cups. He collapsed into his chair with a groan, not noticing the way Hazel's hand stayed protectively over her pocket. "Coming, Pa?" She moved to the stove, letting her hip bump the table as she passed. The performance was automatic now, these small stumbles and hesitations that sold the lie. "That Apache came by the saloon this morning," Thomas said suddenly, asking after work at the mill. Charlie Henderson laughed in his face, said they don't hire savages. Hazel's hand stilled on the pot handle. "But get this," Thomas continued, warming to his story. "Not an hour later, Henderson's prize stallion throws a shoe. And who's the only one in town can calm that devil horse, the Apache? Henderson had to eat crow and pay him double the usual rate." Thomas laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "Serves him right, the pompous fool." "Did he say anything else?" Hazel ventured, immediately regretting the question. Her father's eyes narrowed. "Who the Apache?" "What's it to you?" He studied her with sudden suspicion. "You stay clear of him. Girl, bad enough the whole town thinks I tried to sell you. Don't need them thinking worse." "Yes, Pa." But Thomas wasn't done. "Blind girl's got no business with any man, savage or otherwise. You remember that. Only reason I keep you around is Christian charity. Another man might have left you in the snow years ago." Hazel served his meal in silence, the wooden bird a small weight in her pocket. Through the window, she could see people going about their business, the life of Cedar Ridge continuing its predictable rhythm. But somewhere out there, Elias Redstone was working with horses, his hands gentle on creatures others feared to approach. That evening, as Thomas snored in his chair, Hazel sat by the dying fire and pulled out the carving. In the flickering light, the bird seemed almost ready to take wing. She traced each feather with careful fingers, wondering what kind of man took the time to create such beauty, then give it to a girl he'd barely met. "Eyes open?" she whispered to the darkness. Such simple words, but they felt like a key turning in a lock she'd thought would stay closed forever. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the winter sky, and somewhere under those same stars, perhaps Elias Redstone was carving another bird, hands steady and sure, creating small beauties in a world that had precious few. Tomorrow would bring more whispers, more shame, more carefully orchestrated stumbles. But tonight, Hazel held proof that someone saw her truly, and that small certainty warmed her more than any fire. The first time Elias appeared at the fence, Hazel thought she was dreaming. She'd been hanging wash, fingers stiff with cold, when she sensed rather than heard his presence. He stood at the property line, hands working steadily on a broken rail, saying nothing. By the time she'd worked up the courage to look directly, he was gone, leaving only the mended fence as proof he'd been there at all. It became a pattern over the following weeks. She would catch glimpses of him, a shadow at the edge of her vision, a figure in the distance. He never came close, never spoke, but evidence of his presence accumulated like snow. The loose barn door no longer squeaked. The gap in the chicken coop that let in foxes was sealed tight. Fresh game appeared on the doorstep, always when her father was gone. Thomas noticed none of it, lost as he was in his bottles. But Hazel noticed everything. She found herself timing her chores for when she might catch sight of him. Mid-morning at the well, when he sometimes passed on his way to the livery. Late afternoon by the woodpile, where she could watch him work with the horses in Henderson's corral across the way. He had a gift with the animals, moving among them with a quiet confidence that made even the most skittish mare stand calm. 3 weeks after the storm, she was struggling with a heavy water bucket when he appeared at her elbow. She hadn't heard him approach. She never did. He took the bucket from her hands without asking, carrying it as if it weighed nothing. They walked in silence to the cabin, Hazel acutely aware of curtains twitching in windows along the street. Let them look, she thought with sudden defiance. Then, remembering herself, she stumbled over a perfectly visible stone. Don't, Elias said quietly. It was the first word he'd spoken to her since that night. Not with me. Her steps faltered genuinely this time. I don't know what you mean. He set the bucket on the porch and turned to face her. Up close, she could see the lines sun and wind had carved around his eyes, the scar that ran along his jaw. His hair was tied back with a leather cord, and he smelled of horse and leather and cedar smoke. Your eyes follow birds in flight, he said. You step around puddles before your feet would find them. You thread a needle in poor light. His voice carried no judgment, only observation. Why do you hide? The question she'd dreaded for years hung between them in the cold air. Hazel wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed despite her heavy shawl. My father says, she began, then stopped. What could she say that her father had crafted this lie to keep her unmarriageable, to ensure she'd stay and serve him until one of them died? That she'd lived it so long she sometimes forgot which parts were true. Your father says many things, Elias said, most of them worthless as dust. The casual dismissal of Thomas Hartley should have shocked her. Instead, she felt something ease in her chest, like a too-tight binding being cut. People believe what they want to believe, she said finally. A blind girl is pitiable. A seeing girl who pretends is something else. What others believe doesn't make it true. He moved to the fence rail he'd been meaning to fix, producing tools from his coat as if mending things was natural as breathing. Hazel found herself moving closer, drawn by the steady rhythm of his work. Why do you help us? The question escaped before she could stop it. You don't know us. You owe us nothing. His hands never paused in their task. A man chooses what he sees. I see a woman worth helping. Heat flooded her cheeks. You don't know me either. I know enough. He tested the rail, satisfied when it held firm. You feed the birds when you think no one watches. You leave water for the stray dogs. You sing when you believe yourself alone, quietly, but true. Hazel's breath caught. She did sing, barely above a whisper. Old hymns her mother had taught her. She'd thought herself unobserved in those moments. You watch me. Now it was his turn to show discomfort, though it was subtle, just a slight tension in his shoulders. I watch everything in this town. It's how I survive. He packed away his tools with careful precision. But yes, I watch you more than most. The admission hung between them like morning mist. Hazel knew she should go inside, should maintain the boundaries that kept Cedar Ridge functioning in its narrow ways. Instead, she found herself sitting on the porch steps, uncaring of the cold seeping through her skirts. "Tell me about the horses," she said. A smile ghosted across his features, the first she'd seen from him. He leaned against the repaired fence and began to speak. His voice was different when he talked about the animals. Warmer, almost gentle. He told her about the mare that would only take sugar from his left hand, the stallion that feared butterflies, the old draft horse that liked to have his ears rubbed just so. The sun tracked across the sky as they talked, or rather, as he talked and she listened. She learned that he'd come from the territories to the south, that his mother had been Apache and his father a Scottish trader, that he'd been breaking horses since he was 12. She learned that he carved in the evenings because his hands needed to be busy, that he could read the weather and the flight patterns of geese, that he'd once spent 3 days gentling a wild mustang only to set it free because wildness deserved to stay wild. It was only when shadows grew long that Hazel realized how much time had passed. "My father is at Murphy's saloon, deep in his cups." Elias straightened. "He won't be back before midnight." She should have been ashamed that he knew her father's habits so well. Instead, she felt only a weary acceptance. The whole town must laugh at us. Let them laugh. He moved toward the gate, then paused. "You have more strength than you know. Hazel Hartley. One day you'll believe it." He was gone before she could respond, melting into the gathering dusk with that uncanny silence. She sat on the steps until full dark, replaying the conversation in her mind. Her name on his lips had sounded different somehow, like a truth instead of a burden. Inside the cabin, she lit the lamps and prepared a simple supper that her father probably wouldn't eat. The wooden bird sat on the mantel now, wings spread in eternal flight. Looking at it, she could almost imagine what it might feel like to soar above Cedar Ridge, to see the town laid out small and insignificant below. When Thomas finally stumbled home, reeking of whiskey and worse, he found his daughter sitting by the fire, hands folded in her lap. She didn't flinch when he knocked over a chair, didn't react to his slurred complaints about the cold supper. But behind her carefully blank expression, something had shifted. Elias's words echoed in her mind. "You have more strength than you know." For the first time in 7 years, Hazel May Hartley began to believe it might be true. The gossip started as a trickle and became a flood. What had begun as whispers about the night of the storm grew into something uglier, fed by idle tongues and winter boredom. By the time the first thaw came to Cedar Ridge, the story had twisted into something unrecognizable from the truth. "That Apache visits regular now. Mrs. Weatherby announced to anyone within earshot at the general store. Bold as brass, fixing things about the Hartley place. What kind of man spends time with a blind girl unless he's got unnatural notions?" "Maybe he feels sorry for her," suggested Mary Patterson, though her tone suggested she believed otherwise. "Sorry, Mrs." Weatherby's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "Men like that don't know sorry. He's after something. Mark my words. And that fool Thomas Hartley's too drunk to protect his own daughter." Hazel heard it all, of course, in a town the size of Cedar Ridge. Secrets were luxury no one could afford. She kept her head down, played her part, but the words burrowed deep like splinters under skin. The worst came on a Tuesday afternoon at Murphy's saloon. Thomas had been drinking since noon, holding court with the other wastrels who made the establishment their second home. Hazel had come to fetch him, a futile effort, but one she made when the cupboards were bare and she needed money for supplies. She heard her father's voice before she reached the doors, loud and slurred with whiskey. "That Apache thinks he's something special, sniffing around my place. Probably figures a blind girl can't tell the difference between a white man and a savage." Laughter erupted from his audience. Hazel froze on the boardwalk, hand pressed against the rough wooden wall for support. "Tell us, Tom," someone called out. "What's it like having a useless daughter can't see, can't marry, can't do nothing but eat your food and shame your name?" "She ain't entirely useless," Thomas replied, and something in his tone made Hazel's stomach turn. "Still got all her parts, if you know what I mean. Maybe that's what the Apache's after. Damaged goods come cheap. The laughter that followed was coarse and ugly. Hazel turned and walked away, moving carefully despite the tears that blurred her vision. Behind her, she heard her father's voice rise again, spinning the tale larger with each telling. How he'd offered her in the storm, how even an Apache wouldn't take her, how she was a burden God had cursed him with. She made it 3 blocks before the sobs came, ducking into the narrow alley between the millinery and the barber shop. She pressed her face against the cold brick wall and let the tears fall. 7 years of swallowed pride and careful pretense. And this was what she'd become. A joke told in saloons. A cautionary tale about the dangers of imperfection. Don't waste salt on fools. The voice came from above. Hazel looked up to find Elias sitting on a stack of crates, a piece of wood and his carving knife in hand. She quickly wiped her face, mortified to be caught crying. You heard. Hard not to. Your father has a voice that carries. He dropped down from the crates with easy grace. Also, Henderson sent me to collect payment for shoeing his horses. Seemed he'd rather not set foot in Murphy's himself. I'm sorry, Hazel said automatically, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. Her father's words, her tears, her very existence. Don't. The single word carried surprising force. You apologize for too much that isn't yours to own. He pulled something from his coat, another carving. She realized this one was a wolf, captured mid-stride, every line speaking of strength and purpose. The wolf doesn't apologize for the sheep's fear, he said, pressing it into her hands. It knows its own nature and walks accordingly. I'm not a wolf, Hazel said. I'm not even a proper sheep. I'm just... She gestured helplessly, unable to find words for what she was. You're a woman who's been caged so long she's forgotten she has claws. His dark eyes held hers steadily. But forgetting isn't the same as not having... Before she could respond, he was moving toward the saloon. Hazel wanted to call him back, to warn him that her father was in rare form, that the crowd was ugly with drink and boredom. But Elias walked like a man who'd never learned to fear such things. She stayed in the alley, turning the wooden wolf over in her hands, running her fingers along the carved lines. Through the thin walls, she could hear the saloon noise die down as Elias entered. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Before her father's voice rose again. Well, if it isn't the Apache come calling, you here to make another offer on my blind girl? I'm here for Henderson's money, Elias replied, voice carrying that quiet authority that made larger men step aside. Though if you keep flapping your gums about your daughter, someone might take you up on it. Someone less gentle than me. Gentle, Thomas laughed, but there was an edge to it now. Is that what you call it? Skulking around my property, filling my daughter's head with notions. I call it fixing what you're too drunk to maintain, unless you'd prefer your chicken coop falls down, come next snow. Someone snickered. Thomas didn't take kindly to being made a fool, especially when he was deep in his cups. Maybe I should ask what payment you're taking for all this charity work. My daughter might be blind, but she's still... The sound of a chair scraping cut him off. When Elias spoke again, his voice had dropped to something dangerous. Finish that thought, Hartley. Give me a reason. The saloon held its breath. Hazel pressed closer to the wall, heart hammering. She knew what happened when men pushed Elias too far. She'd seen him handle ranch hands who thought his mixed blood made him an easy target. It never ended well for them. Now! Murphy's voice intervened, jovial with the forced cheer of a man who didn't want blood on his floor. No need for unpleasantness. Tom was just having a bit of fun, weren't you? Tom. Whatever her father mumbled in response was lost, but the tension eased slightly. Hazel heard the clink of coins, then Elias's steady tread moving toward the door. She should have left then, should have hurried home before anyone saw her. Instead, she stepped out of the alley just as Elias emerged from the saloon. Their eyes met across the muddy street, and she saw something in his face that matched the carved wolf in her hand's controlled power, leashed but present. "Thank you," she said quietly. He crossed to her in 3 strides. "Don't thank me for basic decency, and don't let them make you small." He glanced back at the saloon, where voices were rising again, emboldened by his absence. "Your father's a fool, but his foolishness doesn't define you. The whole town thinks—" "The whole town can hang." The vehemence in his voice startled her. "Their opinions are worth less than dust in wind. You know what's true. I know what's true. Let that be enough." He walked her home, maintaining a careful distance that would give the gossips nothing new to chew on. But at her gate, he paused. "Next time your father runs his mouth, let him. Words from a drunk mean nothing." His hand briefly touched hers where it rested on the gate. "But you're worth more than all their words combined. Remember that." Then he was gone, leaving Hazel standing in her yard with 2 wooden carvings and a heart that didn't know whether to soar or break. Behind her, the cabin waited, cold and empty. Ahead, the town spread out under the weak spring sun, every window holding eyes that watched and judged. But for the first time, Hazel found she didn't care what they saw. The spring storm came without warning, turning the afternoon sky black as char. Rain hammered the roof like fists, and wind howled through every gap in the walls. Hazel huddled by the stove, trying to coax warmth from damp wood. When the door burst open, Elias stood in the doorway, water streaming from his coat, hair plastered to his face. For a moment they stared at each other, the storm raging between them. Then he stepped inside, closing the door against the tempest. "The bridge washed out," he said simply. "No crossing until morning." Hazel's hands trembled as she reached for a cloth. "My father—" "Is at Murphy's, where he'll stay until this passes." Elias shrugged out of his soaked coat. "The whole town's hunkered down." She should have protested, should have worried about appearances. Instead, she handed him the cloth and gestured to the chair by the stove. "You'll catch your death." He settled into the chair with a quiet groan, and Hazel busied herself making coffee, hyper-aware of his presence filling the small space. They'd never been alone like this. Walls between them and the world, the storm had created a strange island of intimacy. "You're trembling," he observed. "The cold," she lied, though the cabin was warming now. Hazel, just her name, but weighted with meaning. "Look at me." She turned from the stove, meeting his dark eyes across the lamplit space. The pretense felt suddenly impossible to maintain, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. "Ask me," she said quietly. "Whatever you want to know, ask me." He was silent for a long moment, steam rising from his drying clothes. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. When did it start, the pretending? The question she dreaded and longed for in equal measure. Hazel sank into the opposite chair, hands wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth. 7 years ago, after my mother died. The words came slowly, like pulling splinters. I was 14. Men started coming around, talking to my father about marriage. Hill farmers, mostly, looking for a young wife to work their land. Elias said nothing, but his stillness invited her to continue. "Father had debts, mother's illness." She shrugged. "He could have sold me off, cleared what he owed, but he needed someone to cook, to clean, to fetch him from the saloon. So he told me to play blind, said a damaged daughter was worth more as a servant than as a bride price." "And you agreed?" "I was 14, she repeated. "He was all I had left, and at first it seemed like such a small lie. Let my eyes go unfocused, stumble a bit, bump into things. The suitors stopped coming. Problem solved." Thunder shook the cabin, rattling dishes on the shelf. Hazel flinched, then continued. "But lies are like weeds. They spread. Soon everyone knew Thomas Hartley's blind daughter. Poor thing, they said, What a burden. What a shame. And Father, he started believing it himself. Or maybe he just liked having something broken that was his to command. He blinded them, not you, Elias said softly, echoing his words from that first night. Did he? Hazel set down her cup, suddenly unable to hold it steady. 7 years. Elias, 7 years of stumbling over nothing, of letting food burn because I couldn't see the stove, of pretending not to notice when people stared. I've lived it so long, I sometimes forget which parts are real. The storm lashed harder, wind finding every weakness in the cabin's construction. Elias rose and moved to check the windows, securing a loose shutter. The domestic simplicity of it, a man making sure a house would weather a storm, brought tears to her eyes. Why didn't you leave? He asked, his back to her. Where would I go, a woman alone, no money, no family? And despite everything, he's my father. He wasn't always... She gestured helplessly. Mother's death broke something in him, maybe in both of us. Elias turned from the window. In the lamplight, his face was a study in shadow and gold. You're not broken. Aren't I? The words came out sharper than intended. I lie every moment of every day. I've forgotten how to be real, even now. Talking to you, part of me wants to drop my eyes, stumble over my words, play the part I know so well. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level. Then don't, not with me, not now. The proximity was overwhelming. The heat of him, the scent of rain and cedar, the intensity of his gaze. Hazel felt exposed, like he could see through skin and bone to everything she'd hidden. I'm frightened, she whispered. Of me. Of being seen, really seen. What if you don't like what you find? His hand covered hers where it rested on her knee. I already see you. Hazel, I've seen you leave bread for the birds in winter. I've seen you sing to yourself when you think you're alone. I've seen you walk through this town's contempt with more grace than they deserve. I see a woman who chose her cage to survive, but never let it kill the light inside her. The tears came then. 7 years of unshed salt. Elias didn't move, didn't speak, just held her hand while she wept for the girl who disappeared at 14, for the woman she might have been, for all the small deaths that came with living a lie. When the storm of tears passed, she found herself on the floor beside his chair, her head against his knee. His hand rested light on her hair, undemanding, just present. What happens now? She asked. Now. He was quiet for a moment. Now you choose. Keep the cage if it serves you, or step outside and see what wings you might have. They'll destroy us both. You know that. The town already talks. If they knew the truth, let them talk. His voice carried that quiet certainty she'd come to treasure. Their words can't touch what's real. She lifted her head to look at him. What's real? This, he said simply. You and me, speaking truth in a storm. That's more real than all their gossip combined. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, thunder rolling away toward the eastern hills. Soon it would be morning. The bridge would be repaired. Thomas would stumble home. The world would insist on its careful boundaries again. But for now, in this lamplit space between storms, Hazel let herself imagine what it might be like to stop pretending, to meet the world with clear eyes and straight shoulders, to be seen not as Thomas Hartley's blind daughter, but as herself. Teach me, she said suddenly, how to be real again. Elias smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. You don't need teaching, just practice, and maybe... He reached into his pocket, pulling out another carving. A reminder. It was an eagle this time, wings spread wide, head thrown back in a cry of freedom. She took it with hands that didn't tremble. Eyes open, she murmured, remembering the first carving. Eyes open, he agreed. And when you're ready, wings spread. The rain gentled to a whisper on the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called, defiant against the dying storm. And in the cabin, Two people sat in comfortable silence, building something new from the ruins of old lies. The trouble started 3 days after the storm. What had been whispers became shouts. What had been suspicion hardened into conviction. Someone had seen Elias leaving the Hartley cabin at dawn. By noon, the story had grown into something monstrous. Hazel first sensed it at the well. Conversation stopped when she approached, replaced by a silence thick with judgment. Mrs. Weatherby pulled her daughter away, muttering about influences. The Morrison boys made crude gestures when they thought she couldn't see. By evening, the crowd had gathered. She heard them before she saw them, a low rumble of voices like distant thunder. Through the window, she could see torches bobbing in the darkness, painting wild shadows on the walls. Her father wasn't home yet, lost in his usual haunt, leaving her alone to face whatever came. Hazel Hartley. The voice belonged to Reverend Blackwood, though it carried none of his usual Sunday morning composure. Come out and answer for your sins. Her hands shook as she reached for her shawl. The wooden eagle Elias had carved pressed against her ribs where she'd tucked it inside her dress. A talisman, a reminder. The crowd filled the yard, 20 souls or more. Faces twisted by torchlight into masks of righteous fury. She recognized them all Henderson from the general store. The Morrison clan. Mrs. Weatherby, with her perpetual scowl, deepened to something darker. There she is, someone called. The blind girl who sees plenty when it suits her. Hazel kept her eyes carefully unfocused, hands trailing along the porch rail. The performance was automatic, even now. What do you want? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. We want the truth. Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, Bible clutched in one hand. About you and that Apache. About what ungodly acts have transpired under this roof. Nothing. Liar, Mrs. Weatherby's voice cut like glass. My husband saw him leaving at dawn, staying all night with an unmarried woman. Have you no shame? The storm, Hazel began, but the crowd wasn't interested in explanations. Storm or no storm, it ain't proper. Henderson added, bad enough your father's a drunk. Now you're carrying on with a savage, bringing shame on the whole town. They pressed closer, torchlight dancing off angry faces. The heat was oppressive despite the cool night air. Hazel felt the porch rail at her back. Nowhere left to retreat. I've done nothing wrong, she said, louder this time. Nothing wrong. The Reverend's voice rose to his preaching cadence. Fornication is a sin. Girl. And to lay with a heathen, we didn't. The denial stuck in her throat. What was the point? They'd already decided her guilt. Look at her, someone called from the back. Playing innocent, playing blind. But we know better now, don't we? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The Morrison boys started a chant. Send her out, send her out. Hazel's mind raced. Where was Elias? Where was her father? But she knew the answer. She was alone, as she'd always been alone, facing a town that needed someone to hate. What do you want from me? The question came out as barely a whisper. Confession. Reverend Blackwood said, repentance, and that Apache gone by sunrise. Or we'll see him gone ourselves. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Hazel thought of Elias's hands, gentle with horses, careful with wood. Thought of those same hands defending themselves against a mob's fury. The image gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She straightened, letting her hands fall from the rail. The crowd seemed to sense a change, pressing closer still. You want a confession? Her voice grew stronger with each word. Fine. I confess that Elias Redstone is the only soul in this town who's shown me true kindness. I confess that he sees me as a person, not a burden or a joke or a cautionary tale. Shameless, Mrs. Weatherby hissed. I confess, Hazel continued, momentum building, that I'm tired of being your object of pity, tired of stumbling for your comfort, tired of being small so you can feel big. The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't the script they'd expected. And most of all, She took a deep breath. 7 years of truth pressing against her teeth. I confess that... Enough! The roar came from beyond the torchlight. Thomas Hartley stumbled into view. Drunk, but for once, magnificently angry. He shoved through the crowd, placing himself between them and his daughter. "Get off my land," he snarled. "Every last one of you hypocrites." "Now, Thomas," the Reverend started, but Hazel's father wasn't done. "Don't you now Thomas me, preacher. Half you men have tried to buy her off me when you're deep in your cups. Now you come here playing righteous." He swayed but held his ground. "She's my daughter, mine to protect, mine to command, and I say, get out." "You defend her sin?" Henderson asked. "I defend my property," Thomas shot back. "And any man who sets foot on it again will answer to my rifle. That includes you, Reverend, and you, Weatherby. The whole stinking lot of you." The crowd wavered, uncertain. They'd come for easy prey, not a confrontation with an armed drunk. One by one, they began to fall back, muttering threats and promises of consequences to come. "This isn't over," Reverend Blackwood warned. "Sin will out. Thomas Hartley, one way or another." "Get gone," Thomas repeated. And this time they went, torches bobbing away into the darkness like fireflies scattered by wind. Father and daughter stood in the sudden quiet, neither quite looking at the other. Finally, Thomas turned, his face haggard in the moonlight. "Get inside," he said roughly, "and bolt the door." Hazel obeyed, her legs suddenly weak. From the window, she watched him settle on the porch with his rifle, standing guard against the night. It was the most sober she'd seen him in months. Inside, she sank into a chair, the wooden eagle cutting into her ribs. The mob would be back, maybe not tonight, but soon, and next time, her father's drunken protection might not be enough. "I am not blind." She whispered the words to the empty room, testing their weight. She'd come so close to saying them, to throwing off 7 years of pretense in a moment of defiance, but the truth had stuck in her throat, held back by habit or fear or maybe wisdom. Through the window, she could see her father's silhouette, rifle across his knees. Beyond him, the town slept fitfully, nursing its grievances, and somewhere in the darkness, Elias was likely preparing for whatever came next. "I am not blind," she said again, louder this time. The words echoed in the small cabin, a promise or a prayer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town's fury hadn't been quenched, only delayed. But tonight, for the first time in 7 years, Hazel May Hartley had stood straight-backed before her accusers. She hadn't told the whole truth, not yet, but she'd found her voice. It was a start. The morning came gray and bitter, matching the mood that hung over Cedar Ridge like smoke. Thomas Hartley had spent the night on the porch, rifle in hand, but dawn found him slumped in his chair, snoring off the whiskey courage that had driven him to defend his daughter. Hazel covered him with a blanket, studying his weathered face. In sleep, she could sometimes see traces of the man he'd been before grief and drink took hold. She was reaching for his rifle when she heard the horses. 3 riders approached through the morning mist. Henderson led them, with the Morrison brothers flanking him like deputies. But it was the 4th figure, on foot between the horses, that made her heart seize. Elias walked with his hands bound before him, a cut above his left eye speaking of resistance already attempted. His shirt was torn, and dust covered him like a second skin, but he moved with the same quiet dignity that marked everything he did. "Hazel Hartley," Henderson's voice boomed across the yard. "Wake your father. We've got business to conclude." Thomas jerked awake at the sound, fumbling for his rifle before remembering Hazel had moved it. He staggered to his feet, blinking in the pale light. "What's this about?" he growled, though his voice lacked last night's force. "This is about protecting our community," Henderson replied. "We found this Apache skulking around town. Figured it was time to settle matters proper-like." "I wasn't skulking," Elias said quietly. His eyes found Hazel's across the distance. I was working, as I do every day. James Morrison laughed, an ugly sound. Working on what? Planning your next visit to the Hartley place? A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the commotion. They formed a loose circle, hungry for whatever drama the morning might bring. Hazel saw Mrs. Weatherby among them, her face bright with anticipation. Let him go, Hazel said, stepping forward. He's done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. Henderson's voice dripped false concern. A savage carrying on with a white woman, even a blind one. That's wrong in any Christian town. The word blind hung in the air like a challenge. Hazel felt the familiar urge to drop her gaze, to stumble, to play the part. But Elias's eyes held hers, steady and sure. I said let him go. Her voice carried new steel. Whatever quarrel you have is with me, not him. Hazel, get inside, Thomas ordered, but she didn't move. No. The single word fell like a stone in still water. I'm tired of hiding inside, tired of letting others speak for me. The crowd murmured. Sensing something shifting, Thomas reached for her arm, but she stepped away from him too. You want the truth, she addressed Henderson, but spoke loud enough for all to hear. The truth is that Elias Redstone has shown me more respect in 3 months than this town has shown me in 7 years. Respect, Mrs. Weatherby pushed forward. Is that what you call it when a man spends the night? He stayed because the bridge was out, Hazel interrupted. He sat by my stove and drank coffee and spoke to me like I was worth speaking to. If that's a sin in your eyes, then your God is smaller than mine. The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. The blind girl was supposed to cower, not stand tall. She was supposed to beg forgiveness, not offer defiance. Thomas grabbed her shoulder, spinning her to face him. Enough, he hissed. You'll ruin us both. But the motion was too quick, too precise. Hazel caught herself without thinking, meeting his eyes directly. The pretense, maintained so carefully for 7 years, cracked like ice in spring. Wait, James Morrison said slowly. Did you all see that? The crowd pressed closer. Hazel felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. 7 years of lies, 7 years of stumbling in false darkness, all hanging by a thread. It was Elias who broke the silence. She can see, he said simply. She's always been able to see. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Hazel heard gasps, curses, expressions of disbelief and outrage. But she kept her eyes on Elias, drawing strength from his calm certainty. Is it true? Reverend Blackwood pushed through the crowd, Bible clutched like a weapon. Have you been deceiving us all these years? Hazel looked at the faces surrounding her. Friends, neighbors, people she'd known all her life. All of them staring at her like she'd become a stranger. Or maybe like they were seeing her for the first time. My father told me to pretend, she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. After Mother died, to keep the suitors away, to keep me home. Shut your mouth, Thomas roared. But it was too late. The truth was out, running through the crowd like wildfire. 7 years, Mrs. Weatherby breathed. 7 years of lies. She made fools of us all, Henderson added, his face darkening, accepting our charity, our pity, all while laughing behind our backs. I never laughed, Hazel said. I never asked for pity. I just existed, the way my father demanded. Thomas's hand cracked across her face, the sound sharp in the morning air. Hazel stumbled, this time genuinely, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her lip. Elias moved then, bound hands and all. He shoved past the Morrison brothers, placing himself between Hazel and her father. Thomas raised his hand again but found his wrist caught in Elias's grip, the ropes no impediment to his strength. Touch her again, Elias said quietly, and ropes won't hold me. They stood frozen, the drunk and the Apache, while the crowd watched with bated breath. It was Henderson who broke the tableau, producing a pistol from his coat. "Enough," he said. "We came here to remove a threat to our community. Seems we found two." "You can't," Hazel started, but Henderson cut her off. "Can't I, a lying woman and a violent savage who's going to stop me?" The hammer of his pistol clicked back, the sound terribly loud in the morning quiet. Elias didn't flinch, didn't move, just kept his body between Hazel and danger. "I will." The voice came from the edge of the crowd. Sheriff Coleman pushed through, his own weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. He was new to Cedar Ridge, appointed just 2 months prior, and until now had seemed content to let the town police itself. "Lower the weapon, Henderson." "Now, Sheriff, this ain't your concern." "Armed men threatening citizens is exactly my concern." Coleman's voice carried the authority of law, something Cedar Ridge wasn't accustomed to. "Lower it, or I'll lower you." Slowly, reluctantly, Henderson complied. The sheriff turned to the Morrison brothers. "Cut him loose." "But Sheriff..." "Cut him loose, or spend a week in my jail. Your choice." The ropes fell away. Elias rubbed his wrists, still positioned protectively near Hazel. "Now," Coleman addressed the crowd. "Everyone goes home. Anyone still here in 2 minutes gets arrested for disturbing the peace." "You can't just..." "Mrs. Weatherby began. "I can and I will." The sheriff's hand rested on his pistol. "Move, now." The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering threats and promises. Henderson was the last to go, his eyes promising this wasn't over. When they were gone, only 5 remained Hazel, Elias, Thomas, the sheriff, and the truth hanging between them all. Coleman holstered his weapon. "Miss Hartley, Mr. Redstone, I suggest you both consider your positions carefully. This town has a long memory and a short temper." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving them in the wreckage of 7 years of deception. Thomas broke the silence first. "Get out," he told Hazel. "You've ruined everything. Get out and don't come back." The words should have hurt. Instead, Hazel felt only a strange lightness, like setting down a burden carried too long. She looked at Elias, his face marked by violence, but eyes still steady, still sure. "Yes," she said simply. "I think I will." The snow began falling as Hazel packed her few belongings. Not the violent blizzard of that first night, but gentle flakes that drifted down like ash from a distant fire. Through the window, she could see her father slumped on the porch, bottle in hand, watching her preparations with bloodshot eyes. 7 years in this cabin, and everything she truly owned fit in a single carpet bag. Her mother's Bible, worn soft with handling, the 3 wooden carvings Elias had given her, bird, wolf, and eagle, 2 dresses both patched and repatched, a photograph of her parents from happier days, before illness and grief rewrote their story. Elias waited by the gate, his own possessions loaded on the horse he'd bought with his savings from the livery. He'd said little since the confrontation, but his presence was steady as stone. Sheriff Coleman had advised them both to leave town before nightfall. "I can't protect you from a mob," he'd said simply. "Best you find somewhere else to be." Hazel closed the carpetbag and took one last look around the cabin. Every board, every nail held memories, some sweet, most bitter. This had been her cage for 7 years. Strange how small it looked now. She stepped onto the porch. Thomas didn't look up. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for all of it." He took another pull from his bottle. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Your mother could see right through me too. Never could hide nothing from her eyes." He laughed, a broken sound. "Guess you got that from her." "Pa." "Go on, girl. Get gone before I change my mind and beg you to stay." He still wouldn't look at her. "Maybe you'll find better than what I gave you." Hazel wanted to embrace him, to bridge 7 years of distance in a moment, but some chasms were too wide for gestures. She touched his shoulder briefly, feeling him flinch, then walked to where Elias waited. The town was quiet as they passed through, but Hazel felt eyes watching from every window. Mrs. Weatherby's curtains twitched. The Morrison boys stood outside the saloon, glowering but silent. Even Reverend Blackwood watched from his church steps, though he made no move to stop them. Only at the edge of town did someone approach. Mary Patterson, the doctor's daughter, ran out with a wrapped bundle. "For the road," she said breathlessly, pressing it into Hazel's hands. "Bread and dried apples, and—" She glanced around, then whispered, "I'm glad you can see. I'm glad you're free." Before Hazel could respond, Mary was gone, hurrying back to the safety of convention. But the small kindness warmed Hazel more than any fire. They rode in silence as Cedar Ridge fell away behind them. The snow continued falling, covering their tracks, erasing their passage. Hazel had never been this far from town, and the vastness of the world suddenly seemed both terrifying and wonderful. "Where will we go?" she asked as the sun began its decline toward the western mountains. "South first," Elias replied. "I know people in the territories. Good people who judge a person by their actions, not their blood or their past." And then he glanced back at her, a smile playing at his lips. "Then we see what wings you grow when there's room to spread them." They made camp as darkness fell in a grove of cottonwoods by a half-frozen stream. Elias built a fire with practiced efficiency while Hazel unpacked Mary's bundle. The bread was still warm, the apples sweet, simple food, but it tasted like freedom. "Do you regret it?" Elias asked as they sat by the fire. "The truth coming out that way?" Hazel considered. "I regret that it took so long. I regret the years lost to fear." She met his eyes across the flames. "But no, I don't regret the truth." "Your father might take you back. In time, when the whiskey fog clears." "Maybe." She pulled out the wooden eagle, running her fingers over its spread wings. "But I can't go backward, not anymore." Elias added wood to the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. "It won't be easy. The world's not kind to women alone, or to Apache half-breeds, or to those who step outside the lines others draw." "When has it ever been easy?" Hazel asked. "At least now the difficulties will be honest ones." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, answered by another across the valley. The sound should have been frightening, but instead it seemed like a welcome, the wild greeting its own. "Teach me," Hazel said suddenly, "to track, to hunt, to read the weather and the flight of birds. All the things you know. And you'll teach me to read better, to write more than my name, to see the world through eyes that missed nothing for 7 years." "Deal," Elias said, and they shook hands across the fire. Solemn as any contract. The snow had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white. Above, stars emerged one by one, brilliant in the clear air. Hazel had never seen them so bright, had never really looked during all those years of practiced blindness. "I can see the eagle," she said, pointing to the constellation. "And the hunter." "My mother called them by different names," Elias said. "But the stars are the same, always constant, always true." "Like some people," Hazel said softly. He looked at her then, firelight playing across his features. "Hazel, I need you to know I didn't help you expecting anything. You don't owe me." "I know." She moved around the fire to sit beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. "That's why I'm here. Not from obligation, from choice." His hand found hers, careful and questioning. She laced their fingers together, marveling at how natural it felt. No pretense, no performance. Just two people choosing each other despite all the reasons not to. "Now I see you," she whispered, echoing words from what felt like a lifetime ago. "And I see you," he replied, eyes wide open. They sat together as the fire burned low, planning a future neither could fully imagine. There would be challenges, prejudice and hardship, and the weight of convention defied. But there would also be this truth spoken in darkness, hands clasped in promise, and the vast world spreading before them like an unwritten page. In the morning, they would continue south, leaving fresh tracks in fresh snow. But tonight, they were simply two souls who had found each other against all odds, building a small circle of warmth in the wilderness. Hazel pulled out the wooden bird, her first gift from him, and set it on a log where firelight could dance across its wings. Tomorrow it would travel with them, a reminder of cages opened and flight begun. But tonight it stood witness to an ending that was also a beginning, to a blindness cured not by miracle, but by courage, and to a love built on the radical act of truly seeing. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, and below, two people wrote their own constellation, mapped in trust and carved in truth, guided by nothing more or less than the choice to see each other clear. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps somewhere else? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback helps bring these stories of the American frontier to life.